This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then notes on resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month.
Uncovering history is one of the ways that I think we can have impact. I believe having a clear understanding of equity. We have, after the civil rights movement, which benefited many groups, there was this push for equality. Equality is essentially saying that we've been able to bring everyone to the same point, and now we can move forward in equality, and that's not true. We have so much that we need to do to bring everyone to the same point. As long as we are not focused on equity, we will have disparity.
Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky, and today we have another episode in the series, Unveiling Trauma's Impact, Navigating the Hidden Costs. And today our topic is historical trauma with Ingrid Cockhren. She is the CEO of Paces Connection and is a professor at Tennessee State University. And if her name sounds familiar, it's because she did another episode earlier in this series talking about the cost of hidden trauma in the education system. And today we had an amazing conversation about what is historical trauma, what's the relationship between historical trauma and culture, and how can we really get down to addressing the challenges of historical trauma on our current society and what it is really costing us. I think you're going to learn so much in this episode. Thank you for listening. Ingrid, thank you for coming back on the podcast a second time to talk to me about these hidden costs of trauma.
Thank you for having me.
I really enjoyed our conversation from a couple weeks ago, and I know our listeners will have enjoyed it as well. Now, before we dig in, I want to ask you that same question we asked you last time about having dinner with a historical figure. Who would it be and why? Do you have anything to add to your previous answer?
No, it's still Zora Neale Hurston. I think that she was just a really interesting woman for the time that she was in. So she's a Harlem Renaissance writer, and she was just very refreshing. She obviously lived during a dark time in history for African American women. So her mindset and her ability to write in a way that was kind of not sad.
Yes.
Interesting to me. So I would like to, I would definitely want to have dinner with her.
Excellent. All right. I wish I could make that happen. So thank you for sharing again. And today it's a continuation, I think, of our conversation. We're talking about the cost of hidden trauma. And today we're talking about historical trauma and the hidden costs of that, and whether that is actually financial costs or opportunity costs or societal burdens. So just to get us started, we define our terms. Can you tell us what we mean when we say historical trauma?
So historical trauma is pretty much the same as intergenerational transmission of trauma, but within the larger societal landscape. So if you have trauma that passes through generations within a family, this is very common. We are able to kind of wrap our heads around that. If you have a mother who has experienced trauma, let's say she experienced sexual violence, that's going to impact the way that she raises her daughters. or maybe even the way she raises her sons, right?
Mhm.
And so you will have kind of this transmission of trauma through generations, and it happens in a couple of different ways. It can be through the environment, parenting practices, social learning, also genetics. And so when we think about historical trauma, it's not families per se, it's groups of people.
Mhm.
Those groups could be biracial group, it could be ethnicity, it could be geography, it could be things like gender expression and sexual orientation. All of these groups that have kind of these social groupings
Mhm.
that then experience large scale traumatic issues throughout generations.
Wow. This is already seeming like this is a tremendous number of people who are dealing with this. Yeah. And now I know that this is a broad topic and there's not one thing that everybody has experienced, and there's not one way that everybody has experienced that it's impacting their lives. But what would you say are some of the most significant costs for our society because of this unaddressed historical trauma?
Sure. So if we're talking about the United States specifically, because historical trauma is kind of global issue, if we talk about the United States specifically, then we're talking about a great deal of loss. The groups within our society, within our country that have the highest impact when it comes to historical trauma are going to be indigenous peoples and African Americans or descendants of African slaves.
Mhm.
And so these two groups have experienced genocide, enslavement, and also ongoing racial discrimination and isolation.
Mhm.
And so when we look at kind of the landscape of that, I would also include other specific groups, but I'm talking about the most impact. And when I gauge most impact, I'm talking about a cluster of issues. So economic stability, mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes, so impact to life expectancy and quality of life, and other things like educational outcomes. These kind of social determinants of health.
Right.
We can see that these groups are greatly impacted by their outcomes. And so when we are thinking about what it looks like to be historically traumatized, it is a large scale, widespread event in the past that has impacted the way that you see yourself, that you see others, the way that you raise your children, the way that you cook your food, all aspects of what we would call culture.
Mhm.
So much so that we mistake historical trauma for culture often. And so the hidden costs there are tremendous. The obviously potential, right? Individual capacity and potential.
Right.
If, people say things like, what if the cure for cancer is in African American boy's head? What's the likelihood that we're going to get that child's full potential in America? Or what if the cure for diabetes? I mean, we're getting a lot of things cured lately, so that's good. But
Yeah.
what if that is in the mind of a Mexican girl in America who's undocumented? So these are the things that historically have been, extreme barriers for people to live their full potential. So there's that a great deal is just locked up in potential. But there's also the likelihood as we move forward and we contend with our collective past, we're going to have to, really reckon with the issues of, reparations and how we are equitable and give back into pockets of our society that have long been treated poorly.
Right.
That cost us as a collective. And then, of course, when we come to the physical health outcomes, when I talked about African Americans and Indigenous people, both of those groups have such hostile environments historically and currently
Mhm.
that their life expectancy is lower than their other, the racial counterparts. And so we're talking about 4 to 6 years difference in life expectancy
Wow.
based on race. And so, and we tend to conflate the two. It's not that it's, because a person has a certain skin color, they're going to be more likely to get a chronic disease like diabetes or heart disease it is actually the treatment that they experience, as well as the treatment that their ancestors experience, that has an impact on their health, making it more likely for them to have early death. And so just the healthcare costs alone are exponential.
Absolutely. And as you were going to say cataloging this list of costs to society, the lost potential is one that we have no way of even of counting that. And it's heartbreaking to think of the things that we are not going to get as a society
Yes.
from these amazing minds that we're not giving a chance to shine.
And it's very clear at this point when we think historically, the United States in the past has been a forerunner in many different aspects when compared to other countries. And as we have moved forward, we're not number one in education anymore. And this is largely due to our, we're kind of cutting off our nose to spite our face as we have different policies and procedures and kind of these unwritten rules put in place about who prospers and who doesn't in our society. We are stifling our own collective innovation, ingenuity.
Yeah,
And because of that, then it impacts us, in our world standing. But, again, that potential, that lack of innovation, we are getting to a point where we can't even solve problems that other countries have solved because we're so divided around politics and race and other issues that, again, we kind of say that they're culture, but it's really symptoms of historically traumatic events that are still impacting us today.
right. And we're talking about systemic or structural issue here. What are the barriers, in the system, in the structure that's preventing us from making these changes and addressing these incredible costs?
One thing about historical trauma that I kind of alluded to before was that we mistake it for culture.
Mhm,
When it comes to historical trauma, we've essentially created different factions within our society. And we have no idea the level of how different we are. We are essentially living in different worlds. A good example of that is, let's say we both look at, or you get a couple different people together and they look at a video of police brutality,
mhm,
and one is going to say, well, why didn't they just comply? And the other one is going to say, well, this is obviously an abuse of power and they're being too forceful. And they're both looking at the same video. And so the reason why they will look at the same video and have very different opinions or perceptions of the video is because of their background.
mhm.
If my background is that the police are not to be trusted, that they are an enemy to those who look like me, then I'm going to see various, ways that the police officer is the enemy in that visual. However, if my background is that I respect the police and they're there to help me, and it's kind of like your friendly neighborhood police officer is what you're given as a child and throughout life, then when you have those encounters, you're going to say, well, the police officer can't be in the wrong because they're here to help. This other person must be the quote unquote criminal, and they must have done something to deserve this treatment. And that's a good example of how our historical landscape in this country has very much impacted our perception of the world, how we see ourselves and how we see others, driven by the stories that we've been told through generations, the things your grandmother told you, the values of your ancestors and what they've gained through the American experience and what they pass along. And this leads to having a very, very different perception of your environment.
Yeah.
One may be that it's of comfort and safety, and the other may be of, identity threats and assaults that are constant. And this makes for, again, we're living in different worlds because of this. And because it's passed on through generations, you're getting this information from trusted sources, again, grandparents, parents, right? Teachers. And so you are going to believe those, especially in your childhood.
Mhm.
And then as you get older, you may question and push back. But for the most part, people tend to be heavily influenced by those early experiences and their close relatives.
Yes.
And this is another way to really think about it. Historical trauma that doesn't have anything to do with race. We happen to be in a race-focused society, so much of our historical trauma is around race.
Mhm.
But I often talk about historical trauma from the African American experience, mainly because slavery was extremely traumatic, very well documented. We have slave narratives, things of that nature. And everyone can kind of get behind, like, yeah, this would be a traumatic incident. So I use that as a tool to educate. But, everyone has historical trauma, even if we flip it, right? And we think about white people during the settler times and their interactions with indigenous people and slaves. We have to acknowledge that, there were at all pivots within our society, there were white children being indoctrinated into that racist system. Their parents, their fathers, their mothers, when they would see things like violence against indigenous peoples or lynchings, they were there. And I'm sure that they asked questions like, why are we doing this? Or why is this okay? And those answers were that these people are not like us. They are savages. They're not to be trusted. They don't have souls. There's many things that they were told. This then leading to historical trauma that's being passed along through white communities, leading to a lack of empathy
Yeah.
that we can see present today. So it's not so much about race as it is about this transfer
Yes.
of trauma, beliefs, values that go along with being traumatized through generations, and also definitely the physical implications of being in a toxically stressful environment that would change one's DNA.
Absolutely. Given that this problem runs so deep, I mean, just hearing you talk about how it transfers down through generations, how can we foster a greater understanding of the costs of this? And, what steps can we as individuals or as a society be doing to make some real movement here?
Yeah, we have a bit of an understanding of the cost, especially as we think about the symptoms of historical trauma.
Mhm.
So, the symptoms of historical trauma are relationship issues, behavioral issues, addiction, and substance issues,
Mhm.
higher rates of incarceration, lower educational attainment, and poor physical health outcomes, right? And so, in each one of those kind of sectors, we can estimate the cost
Mhm.
that are associated with that. We also are just aware of, if you think about the cost for corporations to implement DEI programs,
Mhm.
that's billions. It's $1 billion industry to implement DEI. The reason why we have to have it is because of the historical trauma of the past.
Right.
All of the, when we think about affirmative action and other policies that require implementation within our society that are attempting to create a more equitable society, those have costs. We can wrap our head around the cost of those kind of things that we didn't do it in the past, and now we have to go back and address it as so that we can become again a more equitable society. One thing that I find is that we just need to know more about our history,
Mhm.
and this will be a way to kind of determine what's needed. When I engage in historical trauma consultations, I look at the past from a certain either geographical. So I've done historical trauma within a specific state or a specific county,
Mhm.
and I look back and I go as far back as the 1400s. What was going on in this area that we're in right now
Yeah.
during settler times and exploration. But I can also look at it from a societal standpoint. So when we look at the plight of women in our society,
Mhm.
when we think about the cost of homophobia, and then you can also do it by sector. So I can look back and go through policies that were racist or exclusionary within the field of medicine, all the way back to the 1600s to today. And so
Yes.
this will help us to kind of look at, this is how we got here. And what does it mean to kind of reverse engineer and address these issues based on root cause, not so much because, and this is one of the issues that we talked about last time was scientific racism and scientific colonialism.
Yes.
We have built our society around kind of white male dominance and white male point of view. And so when white male elites, educational elites, or academic elites decided that race was a thing and they categorized people by race and they said some people were superior and some people were savages and didn't have culture or didn't have civilization. This was their worldview that was then encoded into textbooks and into industry and into sectors.
Mhm.
And so if we think about, we're deeply embedded within this system in
Yes.
many different ways. And so being able to reverse engineer that means that you even need to know how this happens.
Right.
Yeah, how did we get here? Even in the smaller things, like I was reading about a medical device that was created for lung capacity. And I think it's kind of like, you have to blow into it and you can determine lung capacity
Mhm.
of the individual. And they have different scales for Asian and African people descent, right? And so, okay, the thought at the time was that Black and Asian people had lower capacity, lower lung capacity. And so their scales were different, their measurements were different.
Okay.
But if we think about the time and we think about the environments that people were subjected to, it may not have anything to do with any type of genetic race, right? This is scientific racism.
Right.
It may be that white people at the time were in more areas that had less pollution. They may have been generally healthier. They
Mhm.
might have been subject to such intense labor. I mean, there's many other factors there. But because, some people decided in the 1700s that race existed and that we were fundamentally different because of our skin color,
Right.
now we have a tool that's being used to measure lung capacity that's based on skin color. And then we get to today, and that tool is less accurate. It's leading to higher rates of people not getting the diagnosis that they need or the treatments that they need because of skin color. So it's like, even you need to know how we got here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so race, scientific racism, scientific colonialism has invaded all of our sciences.
Wow. It is such important work that you're doing, helping us think about historical racism and all the work that I know you're doing to address these because it's such a multi-pronged problem and it requires a multi-pronged approach. What are some promising practices or approaches are you seeing to addressing this these days?
The big piece that we need to start with is education, which makes this whole pushback on history or critical race theory, it's not great. And the timing is very obvious. So we need to know our history. We need to know the ways in which we made the wrong decision or we went wrong in the past so that we can correct that. So I think uncovering history is one of the ways that I think we can really have impact. I believe having a clear understanding of equity. We have, after the civil rights movement, which benefited many groups, there was this push for equality. Equality is essentially saying that we've been able to bring everyone to the same point, and now we can move forward in equality, and that's not true.
Mhm.
We have so much that we need to do to bring everyone to the same point. As long as we are not focused on equity, we will have disparity. And so equity means really pouring into some groups, and that is not equal. It's not the same piece of the pie. There's a great deal of pushback on that. We need to have a working definition within sectors around historical trauma,
Mhm.
especially medical, because, and I've done a lot of consulting for hospitals, but we still have these terms of genetically predisposed for diabetes or heart disease. And what we know now is if race is not an actual, physical thing, it's more of a social construct,
Mhm.
then we're talking about environmental factors. And those environmental factors are historical in range. And so the impact to my ancestors' physical health is still prevalent today. But that's not because I'm Black, it's because of, slavery and Jim Crow and the Reconstruction era and all of the racial violence that my ancestors went through that impacted them, not only just their DNA, right? Because there is that, which makes it more likely for them to experience chronic disease and cognitive issues, but also the warping of their culture.
Yes.
So the food that they eat is wrapped up in slavery and what they could eat, and wrapped up in slavery and poverty, the way that they cook it, right? This impacts my health. If, back then I don't have access to fresh foods because only white people get fresh meats, and everybody else gets what's left over after that's older, then that means I need to salt it more to get rid of the taste, or I need to salt it to preserve it. These kinds of things passed on through generations is a warping of someone's culture due to the impact of the environment. It's a normal human behavior.
Right.
That's what we all do. However, the environment is not exactly normal. It changes the way that we, our marriage, the way that we get together romantically or in relationship. It impacts the way that we parent our children. So all of these different ways that culture is impacted also impacts our health as well.
Wow, Ingrid, thank you for sharing this. You've opened my eyes in terms of thinking about the culture. I hadn't made that connection, and it's so clear when you say it, how tied together culture is in all of us to historical trauma, and how even I have thought about culture. So thank you for sharing. I mean, this is a problem that was many years in the making, and hopefully it will not be that many years in the unmaking, thanks to the kind of work that you're doing. So we have to end now, but tell our listeners, how can they reach you and learn more about the amazing work that you're doing?
Sure. So I'm CEO of Paces Connection. So that's Paces, PACES connection.com. There's a wealth of resources there as well. I'm also a college professor at Tennessee State University, and I run a consulting company called Cockhren Consulting. And I can be found online at Aces Ingrid on LinkedIn and Twitter. Well, X.
I know I still can't call it X. That's great. I'm going to put links to all of those things in the show notes so we can make sure that people know how to find you. Ingrid, thank you again. This was a wonderful conversation, and I hope it helps in moving the needle on this issue.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to our listeners as well. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinsky, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.